zero dust. Even though the cleanup and removal of the ground zero evidence began within hours of the attacks, not all of it was removed. Many different dust samples were analyzed by scientists all over the world, and what they concluded put the final nail in the coffin of the official story for me. We touched on thermite earlier, but we're going to look into it more deeply for reasons you'll soon understand. Thermite is a chemical mixture, usually of metal oxide and aluminum powder, with several variations. It's often used in fireworks, underwater welding, and military weapons. It can also be used to cut steel beams. When thermite is detonated, it leaves traces of itself in the debris, like perfectly round microscopic spheres of iron, and unexploded thermite itself, both of which were found in the ground zero dust. The fact that explosive residue was found in the dust didn't surprise me, at least not by now. I already knew in my heart it was a controlled demolition. What rocked me was the type of thermite found. You see, it was a special type of thermite called nano thermite, and it meant that the odds that the hijackers could have done this dropped to near zero. My belief system kept taking more hits, which we'll discuss in a bit. For now, though, let's have the experts walk us through the basics.
In 3 different samples from 3 independent researchers, the R.J. Lee Company, the USGS, and Dr. Stephen Jones's work. All 3 separately found these microspheres.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres.
You cannot get a perfectly round sphere of metal from the building tearing apart. The only way you can get that is by starting with a molten liquid. Then the hydrostatic pressure will create the perfectly round sphere as it solidifies.
So what produced all that molten iron? Well, it has in it the chemical evidence of a special incendiary, which is thermite, a high-tech incendiary used to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. These spheres have iron, aluminum, fluorine, manganese, very unusual elements associated only with thermite. And there's small chips of unignited thermite as well.
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips.
We captured the residue after the material had been heated. The red-gray chips, as we ignite them, produce spheres that have iron and aluminum, just like we see in the dust in abundance.
And the composition was very, very similar. And that led to the conclusion of the paper, which was, we've got some form of thermite in these red-gray chips.
What I can confirm also is that these chips, the red layer is thermitic. It does produce molten iron.
I've heard this argument that somehow perhaps someone seeded these samples with nanothermite.
There have been some that have argued that these red-gray chips could be paint of some form.
I've also heard the argument that perhaps the falling buildings just generated this nanothermite. Well, no.
So it wasn't, the red-gray chips are not the primer paint that was used on the WTC steel.
These chips are not naturally occurring. They are not going to form because some materials fall down in a building and touch each other and get compressed together. That's just not what this material is.
What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It is not just 2 powders being mixed.
First of all, the iron oxide grains are uniform and approximately 100 nanometers across. That's very tiny, much smaller than a human hair. The aluminum occurs in plates that are about 40 nanometers across. I have no idea how to make those. I mean, this is a high-tech material, and it's embedded in a carbon-rich matrix with order. These red-gray materials have very orderly sheets containing aluminum.
This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical.
The aluminum appears in thin platelets about 40 nanometers thick. It is the small size of the particles involved in this material that allow us to characterize it as nano thermite.
These really are sophisticated materials and probably only developed in a laboratory.
This is very high-tech thermite, nanothermite. It's not found in a cave in Afghanistan. It's produced in very sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories.
We compared our spike that we got with a spike from known nanothermite, which is produced at a military laboratory. Their measured energy released with known nanothermite was less than these red-gray chips.
What we are dealing with, I think, in World Trade Center is modern military material which is unknown to the general public.
It takes steel and it creates molten steel. So it takes beams of steel and it turns it into molten steel, and it just everything underneath just sinks into the ground like what you saw. And it is a special U.S. military grade weapon.
So the military uses it for a number of different applications.
Okay? It is a military grade weapon. It's not something you could make ever.
I was pretty astonished at how deep this rabbit hole was getting, even though I still had no idea what I was in for. Of course, by now, I had to acknowledge this was a planned demolition, unless I wanted to lie to myself. Maybe you can explain squibs, but how do you explain explosions or the molten steel? And if you explain that, how do you explain the rate of fall or thermite in the dust? I had to face facts. No matter what my heart wanted to believe, these buildings were wired to blow, plain and simple.